Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sister Maria Cordis, and I have taught Chaucer to generations of students here at this beautiful college at Georgian Court University. I want this afternoon to share with you the insights of a great artist, comparing the visual artistry of his frieze to the internal beauty of the words of Chaucer himself. The entirety will bring together both art and literature in a way that I hope will be meaningful for you, as it has always been for my students. The entirety is the center of this great hall of the central building, the mansion of the George Gould estate, which has become Georgian Court University. We know from the life of the Goulds how much they loved the beauty of the equestrian arts, how much they loved horses. And so we can speculate that the first fact that drew the artist to this wonderful pageantry of Chaucer was the fact that the characters are on their pilgrimage on horseback. Another thought that certainly might have influenced the mind of Robert Sewell, S-E-W-E-L-L, the painter, would have been that the bright colors, notice how often crimsons and scarlets appear, accompany well the entirety of this beautiful great hall. When this was designed by Bruce Price, undoubtedly he was thinking in terms both of the taste of the Goulds, the owners of the estate, and also of what would go beautifully together. You'll notice that this hall is filled with images of boys. See the little cherubs just above the front door. Notice that just above them are the intertwined initials, GG, George Gould. They're found everywhere throughout this building. On the gold piano in the music room, for example, that same intertwined George Gould. You'll notice that over the fireplace there are the little knights. Obviously, he loved his own children. Throughout the estate, as well as here in the mansion, you'll find the boys as they grew, and you'll find the continuing theme of they must become ultimately men who are worthy to be on horseback. The whole point of power is what one can do for others in the knightly tradition, which is so much that of Chaucer. When one thinks of pilgrimage, one needs to go all the way back to the Latin root of the word pilgrim. It comes from the Latin peregrinus, which means literally a stranger. We are all ultimately strangers in the world until we find companionship, until we find people who can go with us on our journey. I think, however, that the choice is more than fathers and sons, more than horses, more than scarlet and crimson looking good in the Great Hall. I think it is a question of the pilgrimage of life. The pilgrims are only going from the Tabard Inn outside London to Canterbury. Not many miles, but actually they're on their way from their present position into the holy land which awaits all of us when the pilgrimage comes to its end, the place that hic Jerusalem Celestial, that is called the Celestial Jerusalem. When the Chaucer pilgrim, it's marvelous that Chaucer makes himself one of the pilgrims. When the Chaucer pilgrim is joining the pilgrimage, he doesn't know that he's not alone. He finds himself surrounded by a marvelous cast of characters, 29 in a compagnia of sondry folk. And so these 29 in a compagnia are soon joined by that shy little 30th, Geoffrey Chaucer. When Sewell painted this between 1898 and 1900, the times of the building of this marvelous estate, he was drawn, I think, to make the knight the central figure in the frieze. Technically not a frieze, since this is a free painted canvas, which is affixed to the wall rather than painted directly upon it. But to put the knight in the center, and as you will see, his son directly behind him and the wife of Bath behind him, brings together the romantic and the realistic. Always Chaucer has been beloved for both. Of all the pilgrims, the one who is most the knightly ideal, the ideal of the one who can come down from his high horse, the one who in the course of the pilgrimage makes even the most lowly of characters feel important, feel cherished, is that knight, says Chaucer. He was a very perfect, gentle knight. A very perfect, gentle knight. Knight in the Old English means a servant. And if one has power, one needs in the knightly ideal, I'm not speaking of the knightly reality, which could often be bloody, ugly, but in the knightly ideal, to be a knight, a knight, a servant, made one an exemplar of the noblesse oblige of which the French spoke. Middle English, after all, is not very far from the joining of French with the original Anglo-Saxon, and they cared deeply about and gave to us the tradition of the nobility that obliges, gave to us the tradition of courtesia, gave to us the tradition of all things being given to us that we may give to others. You'll notice that he is very humbly dressed and that his horse was good, but he was not gay. He's a good horse, but he's not fancily apparelled. He is not filled with accoutrements which will draw attention to him. If you look at his son, however, the boy just behind him, you can see that he is indeed clad in the fanciest of clothing, that he is curly of hair, that his horse is very well apparelled. A strange word to use for a horse, but the horse is as fancily dressed as the boy. You can tell that he is not his father, not yet, but someday he will be. He aspires to it. He would love to be like that father of his, although he is described by Chaucer as a lady's man, a lover, a charmer, a singer, a follower of all the sports of love and of romance. He is ultimately, always the last two lines of the description matter, lowly, lowly. Lowly he was, and someday he will be like his father. You'll notice that he is looking warily over his shoulder at the opposite end of the romantic realistic spectrum, looking at the wife of Bath, that famous, wonderful woman who is named as if she is the only wife in the whole city of Bath that matters. She is the wife of Bath. And anyone who has ever loved Chaucer has always loved her for her vibrancy, for her life, for her wit, for her wisdom, for her wickedness, for all those things that make us turn back to her again and again. She's looking for a fifth husband. No, she's had her fifth husband. She's looking for a sixth. She says, welcome the sixth whensoever he shall. Welcome husband number 6 whenever he happens to come along. She has attained a delight in life. She says, Lord God, when it remembereth me about me youth and of me jollity, it tickleth me about mine heartis rota, that he have had me world as in me tema. Lord God, when I remember my youth and my jollity, it tickles my heart that I've had my world in my time. It's a world that is still evolving. He, the knight, when his wonderful story, his own romantic story, as you remember, after we introduce ourselves to the various pilgrims, we, in the tales, hear more deeply about them. The tale informs the teller informs the tale. When he is thinking about what makes a perfect knight, he is at the end of a story in which romantically two young men have striven for the hand of one fair lady, Palamon and Arcita, in their love for Emilia. And now Arcita, the less noble of the two, has been killed by his cousin, not with desire to kill, but in the course of battle. And he has called on his deathbed for Emilia. Arcita is telling his prospective bride, whom he will never marry, that Palamon, his cousin, is a better man than he. It's a hard realization for him, but I think it is in many ways at the heart of the knight's picture of what a good knight should be. And soft tak me in your arms twaia, and for love of God and hearkeneth what he saith. I have here with me cousin Palamon had strife and rancor, many a die agone for love of you, and for me jealousy. Remember I told you that knight means servant. To speaking of a servant properly, with all the circumstances truly, that is to say, this is the list now of what makes a knight, that is to say, truth, honor, knighthede, truth, honor, knighthood, wisdom, bless. Arcita has always lacked humility, but he knows now that that's what makes a man able to acquire wisdom, bless. And then with the anti-democratic feeling of power, a stat, a state, and high kinrede, and high kindred. But he soon goes back to what we would now consider the democratic aristocracy, freedom. Freedom to them meant basically what it means to us, but it also meant to be free of hand, to be free of heart, to give to others, generosity, the noblesse oblige concept once more, the courtesy, the chivalry. And he says, if you are thinking of Palamon, if you are thinking of what makes a perfect knight, if you are thinking of all that longeth to that art, isn't it wonderful to think of goodness as an art? And then I've always found the end of this speech so charming and poignant. It's a beautiful speech and a beautiful moment, and I think a beautiful holding together of that romantic vision. Among the varied characters, these two, as I said, the wife of Bath and the knight, are romance epitomized and reality epitomized, but each has part of the other, and the entirety flows together to make a wonderful whole. My focus will be primarily on those characters who most epitomize the pilgrimage of life as Chaucer sees it. I shan't be speaking of every single character in the frieze for several reasons. One, the question of time itself. Another, the fact that some of the characters are compressed by the painter, by Robert Sewell, made into composite characters. The most famous character probably among those who know the tales, aside from the wonderful knight and the wife of Bath, is Milady Prioressa, my lady the prioress. A fascinating figure in her ambiguity. Everything that Chaucer says about her is charming and leads one to think, oh, a lovely person, I'd love to know her, I'd love to be with her. And then leaves one to say, wait a minute, wait, just wait a minute. You may know that during the Middle Ages, the most powerful organization in all of Europe was not any one of the kings or the kingdoms. For example, the Holy Roman Empire was not holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. Outside of that, the title is perfectly accurate. No, The most important, by far, of the institutions of medieval Europe was the church. The figure of the nun, the prioressa, is, as you can see, an elegant one. Notice that her prim and charming manner, her beautiful white horse, her elegant robe, are all so much in evidence. She's very, very concerned about all things being perfect, but all of the things that Chaucer emphasizes about her perfection come down to externals. There is no mention of kindness except that she would weep if that she saw a moose caught in a trap. She would cry over a mouse caught in a trap. And yet, much of what is the ambiguity of her description comes from the fact that there are silences, big silences. One wonders, for example, when after Chaucer, the Pilgrim, there is a marvelous distinction, incidentally, between the brilliant man who writes and the naive little character he makes of himself, who is awestruck by this beautiful nun. There is a marvelous question that can be raised when one gets to the end of her description by the fact that Chaucer then says, "Another nonna with her had a she, that was her chaplain, and the priest is three." Another nun was with her, that was her secretary, her chaplain, and the priest makes three. Do you see seated behind her a nun coming quietly behind the two of them, the priest? Isn't it fascinating by its omission that one learns nothing about either of them as people? Chaucer leaves us with that wonderful picture of ambiguity. An interesting factor here is that oftentimes Chaucer is thought of because he has figures of ambiguous and even wicked clergymen in the course of his tales, such as the pardoner and the summoner. He is often described as being anti-clerical. Since the church is, as has been said from time immemorial, semper reformanda, always in need of reformation, it's important, I think, to realize that when the Reformation will come a century later, it will begin over the question of the selling of indulgences and the man in the scarlet, how appropriate, in our corner. Again, how appropriate, because his eyes look like those of a cornered rabbit, Shakespeare says, is a man who sells indulgences. The man who is in the corner, and Chaucer would, I think, approve of Sewell's positioning of him, is caught in a corner. He is the pardoner. He is the seller of indulgences. Out of his corrupt trade will bloom ultimately reformation, both in the church and taking the church apart into other churches. The pardoner is a seller of indulgences because he is trapped in life. He feels small. He feels like a rabbit caught in a trap. And eventually he explains that he has no veil of the Blessed Mother. He has an old pillowcase that he's trying to sell to us. He explains to us that he is caught, that he is trapped. "I will not they deceive, I will not deceive thee." But he doesn't leave the pilgrimage any more than any of the other characters will leave the pilgrimage. They belong with us, they belong to us. One must remember that Chaucer dies in 1400. I always tell my students he does so very neatly and obligingly to end the High Middle Ages in England. Oh, I know it will go on, tapering into the 15th century before the Renaissance comes, but to my mind, when Chaucer is gone, it's gone. That's it. And you must remember that the 14th century was the time of the Great Plague that afflicted all of Europe and took literally 1/3 of the population of Europe in just 3 years. and the plague hit England even harder in many instances than it did the continent, an age in which the plague would strike a visitor to a home almost immediately upon leaving that home. One has to think, who goes out to tend the ill, the good priest or the bad one, and who survives the plague as a consequence? Obviously, one of the great reasons for the great corruption that filled so much of the time is precisely that the good were burying the dead and becoming part of that sadness, while the superficial, the vain, lived on. Cast your eye forward past the nun and her entourage. You'll notice just beyond them a pillar that we're passing, a faint handprint on that. That is the sign in the Middle Ages of the presence of Black Plague within the house. In an age where most people were illiterate, one could tell by the black hand of death upon the wall of a house that to enter is almost a death sentence in itself. I point to that in relationship to this question of death, of corruption in a church which ought to be semper reformanda, always reforming. I point to it because that is not anywhere in the Canterbury Tales. That is Sewell's own addition to the concept of which I've just been speaking, that death and sin are interrelated. Sewell appropriately places the clerk, the clerk, at the end of the pilgrimage because Chaucer does so. Chaucer says that he is always by himself, always reading. Even though the characters are riding, still he rides with book in hand. Clerk to them meant a learned man. It is a cognate of cleric, and he is probably a young Oxford scholar who will grow old as an Oxford scholar and cares about his book, cares about his teaching, and cares little, it seems, for interaction with people. When we move to the brilliant, brilliant story that the clerk will finally tell us, we realize what a wonderful teacher he must be there at Oxford. I always tell my students who major not just in literature but also in education that unless they are glad at the thought of being teachers, they shouldn't do it. They should find another profession. As we round the corner, we see an ermine-clad and velvet-clad figure. He might be Sewell's composite of the doctor and the Franklin, both of whom would have worn elaborate clothing of that sort. I take him to be the Franklin because the Franklin is a dear friend of mine. I love his approach to the unity and diversity between man and woman. I love the fact that the young couple in his story are actually disparate in intellect, she more brilliant than he, but he the master of the world in public. They say to each other, "Friendes everik order mot obeya," friends obey each other. And I have always thought, what a marvelous basis for all marriage, friendship of equals, friends who obey each other. In public, he seems masterful. In private, she makes decisions. A beautiful example of the relationship of man and woman. To move to a less austere topic, notice that Sewell is doing another interesting and, in a way, dangerous thing. He is beginning, because after all, when we think of this frieze, we must remember that the characters are on their way to Canterbury, and the miller, with his pipe, pipes them out of Tuna, out of town. It's a brave and a dangerous thing to begin our pilgrimage with a drunken miller who is about to fall off his horse. When the knight had finished his beautiful tale, the miller insisted that he had to go next. Everyone said, "Oh no, let a more worthy man speak next." And he said, "I will speak or else go on me way. I will speak or else I'll go on my way." He says that he will tell his story no matter what, and he says it in a piping voice that makes him realize he's drunk. He didn't know it until he heard his voice. He said, "I am drunk, ik know it by me soon." I'm drunk, I know it by my sound. He has a pipe, but he also has a bottle. The pitch pipe to pipe them out of town, but a bottle as well. And they say, "Go ahead, tell your story." His story is a bawdy one. Many of the people who love Chaucer love him for the romance, love him for the realism. Some love him for the bawdry, and that too has its place in the composite of life. We find ourselves, I think, laughing with Chaucer's characters and realizing that laughter is the antidote to the tears, to the pain, to the plague, to the death, that laughter brings us together. We laugh at things so that we can bear them. We laugh at things that would be too big for us to cope with. One of the reasons that there are jokes about sex is that sex is difficult. One of the reasons that there are jokes about religion is that religion is difficult. One of the reasons that there are jokes about politics is the way in which a country is governed is a difficult question. We laugh to make things smaller, to bring them within our grasp, to do something that makes the journey possible. We move on our way, and ultimately that way brings us to the high Jerusalem, which is celestial. The one pilgrim whom Chaucer describes as perfect as the knight is perfect. Do you remember I said that he was a very perfect, gentle knight? The other perfect character is the country priest of whom I spoke, and he is the one who gives the last story. Chaucer, a great, great poet, is not nearly as fascinating in prose. Prose was not as fascinating yet as poetry would be, because poetry touches the ear in an illiterate society as prose so often cannot. The final story, in which the good priest brings us out of town, probably that quietly unassuming man just behind the miller, probably it's he. The story that he tells that ends the entirety, that knikt up, that knits it all together, is in prose and not one of the great tales. It is a long, long sermon. Here is God's plenty, says Dryden of Chaucer, as I told you earlier. And in the entirety of life, there are the high moments and the low, the laughter and the tears, the exultant and the humble. We arrive at our destination, Canterbury, and we are arriving symbolically at the Jerusalem Celestial, at the heavenly Jerusalem. The quiet country priest who finishes our story is perhaps saying to us that in the dear dailiness of life, we ultimately come past the glorious parts, the funny parts, the dull parts, to the heavenly Jerusalem. Now we have come to the end of our pilgrimage sharing with those of Chaucer. I pray that your pilgrimage in life will be as beautiful and as meaningful as was his and his companions. I hope that, like his Ninan 20 in a compania, you yourselves will be in company with pilgrimage with pilgrims, with strangers who become friends. And I hope that you have become friends this afternoon with Georgian Court. God bless you all.